Hey everyone, I wanted to go ahead and start a little discussion with you guys since I haven't necessarily done one of these type of videos in a while, mostly because I've been focused more on the newsy side of things as Capcom has been dumping out with a bunch of information, so I've certainly been wanting to cover that. But in this video, I wanted to try to answer the very basic question: what is going to be the final boss of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak? And I certainly want to hear your guys' opinions, so do let me know in the comments what you think is going to be the final boss of the game as far as we know it. Now, one of the things needs to be cleared up right away, and that's the fact that we have direct confirmation from Capcom themselves in one of the most recent interviews that they did with, I believe, Famitsu. They did confirm that the entire story of Sunbreak is going to be available on day one. They are not going to be doing that same thing that they did with Monster Hunter Rise, where a couple of patches down the road they decided to patch in Allmother Narwa, and oh, by the way, that is the final boss of the game. They're not doing that this time around. I think they learned their lesson, and it seems like whatever we get on day one, that will be the actual story of the game. Whatever they add extra will be just extra. Of course, we're expecting new monsters and stuff like that, but you know, losing Nargacuga for starters and a couple of others, which I certainly want to tackle at a later date. But we do know that the story, as far as the story for Sunbreak is concerned, is going to be all compacted and available on day one, so we don't have to worry about that. Something else worth considering is the fact that we know there's an anomaly happening in the Citadel. We actually get to see this in the Malzeno Castle. Essentially, we know there's a shrine right there, glowing red. Something happened. We don't necessarily know what could have transpired, but it didn't necessarily come from Malzeno. We know that Malzeno's power has nothing to do with what is going on in that specific area of the map. This is something that another one of the interviews that they did recently with one of the Japanese outlets, and I wish I could give credit to them because I don't quite remember which one it was. They did ask this specific question of like, what did we actually get to see? Because that clip that you're probably seeing on screen right now was posted about a month before these like most recent wave of press that they started to do. And they basically did not wish to respond that at all. So this is, of course, completely connected to the story. We know Malzeno is connected to the story, but we also know Malzeno is not the final boss of the game. Usually the flagship monster never is. So with all that table setting out of the way, and I'm sorry if it took so long, but I just wanted to be as thorough as possible, I think there's three distinct ways we can actually choose to go about this. One would be a returning monsters. This is something that basically Capcom has been thriving to do in this specific game. We've seen the returning monsters already. They're pretty great. But when it comes to Sunbreak, it could be the possibility that returning monster actually could take the point and be the final boss of the game. I tend to see this to be the least likely of the opinions tossed around out there, and something that I wouldn't necessarily be too happy about, since it would be a returning monster being the final boss. But there are some fair candidates that I want to go over in a bit. The second biggest theory that I think would be worth considering is that the final boss of Sunbreak needs to have or should have some sort of connection with Narwa, either Ibushi or both of them together as Allmother Narwa, something related to them. And the third option that I think is certainly, the most likely one, and this is the reason why they're being so hush-hush about the story itself, is the fact that this is indeed related to the sun, as the name implies, Sunbreak. Every single monster that they have revealed so far has nothing to do with the sun whatsoever. So this is, of course, I think the most prevalent theory that could be presented. So when it comes to returning monsters that I think could actually be the real reality of like an endgame monster, I think there's only 4 names that I could come up with, and one of them, I don't necessarily know why I thought this, but it would just be funny to see. And the first one would be Nergigante. Now, of course, Nergigante was the flagship of World. He wasn't even the final monster of his very own game. But the fact that it would be just funny for them to present it as the final boss of the game when it comes to a game that is not even his to begin with, I think it would be just a really funny twist and a little bit of a jab to those Monster Hunter World fanatics who continually complain that Rise is a lesser game when it's clearly not. At the very least, Sunbreak is starting to show that they're going to be on par. If you're worried about visuals, then yes, World looks better. But when it comes to gameplay, I think Rise and Sunbreak is looking much more improved. The second name that I wanted to toss out there is Fatalis. Now, this one is, of course, not only a fan favorite, but a monster that's been kind of making his way around most of the games when it comes to Monster Hunter. It appeared in Freedom 2 and Monster Hunter 4, Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, Generations Ultimate. It appeared in Iceborne as DLC. It appeared in Monster Hunter Stories and Frontiers G. I mean, it's just been everywhere. Fatalis is one of those really popular monsters that people have been always wanting to fight, and it's always a really interesting fight because it's one of those more traditional elder dragons. Essentially, it just kind of like gives fans that original Monster Hunter feeling that, you know, a lot of hunters just continually wish to chase. So I think it's always a good choice to have it. Maybe it makes more sense as a post-launch DLC than an actual final boss. Maybe something like a such species would actually qualify here a little bit better as the final boss, since it does follow in those same themes as what we have seen with Sunbreak so far when it comes to the Citadel, and of course Malzeno's, the whole regalness about it. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think this one, I think it's a fascinating idea to see if they could do a such species of Fatalis, and it would probably fit in story-wise rather well with what they're trying to do. Now, another one that I cannot go a video without mentioning is, of course, Nargacuga. This one was the final boss of Generations Ultimate, and I think it's kind of like a little bit on brand, specifically with what they're trying to do, bringing back Daimyo and Shogun, and we don't necessarily know if they're going to bring in another couple of those cephalod-like monsters, basically, that we have seen throughout the past and previous games. So we don't necessarily know if this one would be one of those like arena type battles that they would like to do, where it's just post-launch DLC, again, kind of like Fatalis. But I think it's one of those monsters that's always been really interesting. The fight is extremely unique. There's nothing like it. It feels very reminiscent to me. It's different, but I say reminiscent in the same idea as Amatsu. It's just an original idea, not necessarily like anything we've seen before, and I think it would be a fantastic addition. And if it ends up being a final boss, I think it would be just really interesting. Again, a such species type of this one, I think would be more qualifying in the same way that I mentioned with Fatalis, but I think it makes a lot of sense worth considering. I did quickly mention there Amatsu, and I'm fully 100% on the boat that is going to be one of the post-launch DLC monsters because it just makes too much sense. So I wouldn't necessarily expect it to be one of those monsters that's like, you know, the final boss of the game. I just wouldn't necessarily expect that. Now, since the floodgates for Frontiers monsters have been open, one of the best and I think most qualified fights that we could actually expect to see as the final boss would be Yamasukami. Now, I don't necessarily think this one is on brand specifically when it comes to, you know, what Sunbreak is presenting that it's trying to do. This one did originally appear in Monster Hunter 2, Portable second, and then of course in plenty of versions of Frontiers. But I think it's just one of those monsters that people kind of like Gore have been saying, we want to see it, we want to see it, we want to see it. And I think it makes a lot of sense if they decide to bring it back. I don't necessarily know if it would actually qualify as the final boss encounter, only because of just how unique and how weird it actually is. I don't even think it's on brand, realistically speaking. But I think if they decided to go that route, again, with a such species or a different version of this monster battle, again, a mountain-like creature that is just extremely powerful and as weird looking as it actually is, I think it would just be a fantastic way to go about it. But again, it's one of those where, like, if Capcom is adamant to keep it on brand and basically focus on what the branding of the game is, then, you know, it wouldn't necessarily make more sense. And when it comes to the branding of the game, I think the second pillar of the original three that I mentioned, I think is worth discussing, and that's the fact that it could be that the final boss has a direct connection to either Narwa, Ibushi, or Allmother Narwa. Now, Allmother Narwa having a such species and coming back, I think that's a fair expectation. I think that's not necessarily out of the realm of a possibility. I think a lot of people have thrown out the idea that perhaps the bastard child of Allmother Narwa could be one of those monsters that's coming out for revenge for you, the hunter itself. It's a personal vendetta against you. I don't necessarily know how much I subscribe to that idea, only because we know that some of the more powerful monsters, like in the lore of the game, are usually like pretty old. That's why elder dragons, that's what idea comes in. Usually like newly birthed, newly formed monsters don't necessarily are the most powerful ones. That's usually not the way it works. There's a rare occasion here and there, but that's not usually the way this works. So I think, you know, when it comes to a direct connection to Allmother Narwa, if the idea is that she has been slain, there are no more Allmother Narwas out there, you know, maybe there was an offspring, maybe that would be a fight you would have. It would be an interesting connection to Rise, but to expect it to be the final boss, it would feel a little bit off, unless again they could come up with some weird way to actually go about it. I think the third and final pillar that I did mention at the beginning of the video was, of course, the direct connection to the sun itself. And I think there's a lot of signs here specifically that are like pointing towards that direction. First and foremost, we have the return of Gore Magala, a monster that basically hates the sun and brings in the nightfall, so much so because it hates the sun so much. We also have Malzeno, which is a vampiric type who hates the sun and avoids it at all costs. We have Luna Garen, literally a wolf that turns into a werewolf that howls at the moon. Pretty much every single monster that they have revealed so far as making an appearance in Sunbreak have some sort of direct connection to the moon. In fact, the moon was an ongoing theme in the first 3 official trailers for Sunbreak. Every single thing that they have shown so far has a direct connection to the moon itself. However, the title of course of the game is Sunbreak. And this is something that I was very adamant with at the very beginning of the reveal of Sunbreak, was that this is going to be a bait and switch. At the end of the day, there's going to be a sun-related monster that is just pretty much going to either try to block out the sun or use the power of the sun to basically become more powerful. And that is how we're going to go about this whole story. And I think when they keep referring to the anomaly, but they're not willing to share it, I think there's a couple of connections with Malzeno right there that are worth considering. Some of those signs actually come from those flying giggies. I don't actually know their official name, that's why I call them the flying giggies, but essentially these are the leeches that Malzeno has with him. And when Malzeno is being taken down, they basically just leave his body altogether. We know that they have like a direct symbiosis connection with Malzeno. He uses them to drain the energy and the life source out of other monsters so he could become more powerful and they could stay alive at the same time. But whenever he's about to die, guess what they do? They bail. They're not interested in sticking around. They're not interested in getting killed themselves. There's something going on there that is, I think, worth considering, that Malzeno's kind of being used as a plot device, a little bit of a ploy essentially, where there's another monster kind of also getting more powerful as Malzeno continually just disrupts the environments and continually drains the life of other different monsters. This monster in the background is just getting more and more powerful as Malzeno continually does that. So I think there's something along with that I think I've seen a lot of clips when it comes to just the weird actions of the leeches, when it comes to Malzeno's engagement with a hunter or other life forms in the maps that we have seen so far, specifically in the lava caverns. So I'm not necessarily too convinced that those leeches aren't necessarily connected to something else. And that something else is just the fact that the game is called Sunbreak and we haven't necessarily seen a single monster related to the sun itself. We haven't necessarily seen any real connection to what this title actually is supposed to mean. We know that according to the developers themselves, they spoke about Monster Hunter Rise being related to the verticality of the game. Essentially, Rise suggests that you can go up, you can go down, you can move around, you have the freedom of movement that they didn't necessarily feel like they quite nailed before. When it comes to Sunbreak, what's sun related to it? What's break related to it? Gore? No. Malzeno? No. None of these like really important monsters that they've showcased. Espinas? No. Nothing like that has really been like a direct connection to the title itself, and there's always something there. So I'm just waiting to see that twist revealed, and I think that if we're really going to believe that Nintendo is going to have a Nintendo Direct on June 29th, I think it's a pretty good expectation to go into it, hoping to see and wanting to see the release date trailer, essentially the last trailer that we're going to get to see for the game on that Nintendo Direct, because it would essentially be the day before the game launches. Now let's keep this in perspective as well. Review copies are most likely out already, and most likely reviews are going to go out this week. I don't necessarily know if any of the reviewers will be dumb enough to reveal the final boss. This is something that is actually going to be in like the review embargo to mention, like after a certain point do not show any footage. So, you know, we'll most likely end up seeing it leaked rather than, you know, someone actually putting up the gameplay clip out there, you know, with their name on it. It will most likely just end up getting leaked, like a certain other monster in the Citadel that we saw. I certainly want to make a video about that. But all in all, those are my theories as to what the final boss could potentially be for Sunbreak. I certainly want to hear your guys' takes on this. I'm sorry that it was a long video. I usually don't try to do long videos, but, you know, in this one, I just kind of went on a little bit, and I wanted to get my takes out there. So if you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.